We want to know who you are and what organization that you're representing. And as we're doing that, I want to introduce our Place Matters director, Mr. Rod Smith. Rod, if you could just share a little bit about yourself and Place Matters.
Thank you, Cedric, and good afternoon to all of you, and especially to you, Dr. Doe. Thank you so much for being with us this afternoon. I'm looking forward to your conversation and learning more about today's topic. I'm really excited about our front porch conversation as well. I am a country boy, not only at heart, but in spirit too. And so I spend quite a bit of time on my front porch over here in High Point. Not quite as much since it's been so hot. And so most of my front porch time now has been later in the evening. But I'm excited about this concept, and I think it speaks volumes to the work that we're doing with Place Matters, and really is an echo of that work in the fact that it is a front porch, because we're all about community engagement. And so, as Cedric said, my name is Rod Smith. I am the director of our place-based initiatives, and our work right now is entitled Place Matters. And Place Matters is a place-based initiative that happens in the northeast corridor of Winston-Salem. And so, a historically marginalized community. It is, however, a community where the people are passionate about their neighborhoods and about the place that they call home. And we're we're very glad and very excited to be a part of that, the efforts that they're doing there. Place Matters is made up of 13 contiguous neighborhoods. In terms of our footprint, it begins down off of New Walkertown Road near the intersection of New Walkertown and Martin Luther King, for those who are familiar with that part of the community, and goes up New Walkertown, up in Northampton, and curves off by Carver School Road. And so it's a total of 13 neighborhoods. And when you look at the area of influence also, that immediate radius around the community, the work we do there affects about 10,000 of our neighbors in Northeast Winston. The basic tenets of our Place Matters work is that it is equity focused. And so we are making sure that the people who are served by the efforts that we undertake there are also intimately involved in that work. And so to that end, our work is resident-led and resident-engaged and resident-informed. So prior to each investment cycle, we're right now in the second year of our second investment cycle. We conduct a community assessment, and that work helps to, what we find in that assessment helps to guide the work that we do. And so we have right now 20 funded nonprofits who serve particular efforts in the Place Matters. So whenever we put out our assessment, they told us that their concerns were housing, healthy living, education, and unemployment and underemployment. And the RFP that went out was specifically focused on those 4 areas. And so it brings back the point again that this work is resident-led and resident-informed. We have a resident impact council made up of representatives from those 13 neighborhoods, and they give us our marching orders to tell us how we should move forward and how we make our investment. And so our work is resident-led, and it's also about asset-based community development. So taking what the community has, taking those strengths, and expounding upon them and making the work even more relevant and more meaningful to that community. And then finally, perhaps the most important part of this work is that we are doing with rather than for, which is a very different way for nonprofits to operate in communities, because so often we have gone to communities and told them, listen, these are your problems, and these are the solutions that we propose. But with our Place Matters work, we have said, we're here to be a part of the solution. Tell us how can we help. And so we're working with rather than working for. And part of that working with means that you have to listen to them. And there's perhaps no better place than to sit down and listen to a person than on their front porch, which brings us to what we are doing today. And so thank you all. I see a lot of faces up here. I'm very excited to have Dr. Doe on the line, and thank you to Cedric for coordinating this effort. Cedric has been a godsend in terms of helping to spearhead our faith-based engagement efforts, and we thank him too for this work. So thank you, sir. Cedric, I believe you may be on mute still.
Yes. Thank you, Rod, for sharing with us about Place Matters and the important work that's going on in East Winston. And if you want to know more about Place Matters,
Dr. Doe, I believe you may be on mute then.
I am.
Place Matters, the Place Matters work. So again, my name is Cedric Parker. I am the Faith-Based Community Engagement Coordinator with the Place Matters Initiative. And basically what that looks like is engaging, equipping, and empowering the faith community in regards to the work that the Place Matters Initiatives does in the community. And so that's why we have gathered here today in terms of the asset, which is the church or the faith community. And so we know in the asset-based community development model that one of the anchor institutions is the faith community. And so today, I think we have an expert in faith-based community development with Dr. Catherine Ado. I'm going to introduce her. And Dr. Catherine Ado has helped churches, faith-based organizations, schools, and nonprofit organizations improve the quality of their community-focused programs for over 20 years. Her formal training and certifications in education, law, theology, and community development have uniquely prepared her to help nonprofits start and to grow. Dr. Ado is on a mission to rebuild communities as she bridges gaps and connects neighborhoods. She uses practical principles to create long-term solutions to challenges faced by under-resourced communities. Dr. Ado teaches nonprofit seminars and is a high-demand speaker, and she shares her passion and innovative community initiatives. Additionally, she serves at the community through a weekly radio broadcast called Community Inspirations with Dr. K, which is a weekly broadcast. And Dr. Ado is a board member of several Christian-based nonprofit organizations. And so today, again, the asset, which is the church, is also looking at how this relates to our communities and how our communities are normally, in the past, one of the things that reminds us so much of community is our home, and not only our home, but the porch as being the basis where we engage with our neighbors, where we are able to see children out at play, to see the folks as they go by and to wave. And in that space is where we want to kind of use this forum to talk about what that means in regards to community development and also what that means for faith-based work. So with that, I will turn our conversation on our front porch over to Dr. Catherine Ado.
Thank you so much, Cedric and Rod. I appreciate it. Can everybody hear me? Excellent, great. All right, so I am really excited about being with you all here today because this work as far as faith-based community development is something that I've been doing for really like 24 years now. And having had training as an attorney, and then having been called into the ministry, and then trying to figure out how do I make all of this happen. I was introduced to faith-based or Christian community development while I was in seminary. And that really has formed the basis of a lot of the work that I do in local communities. My passion and calling is grassroots organizations, small communities, and we have, it's just been an exciting ride, certainly this last 6 years as we started the business. So we'll talk about that in a little bit. Now, I'm going to pull the presentation up now. So I'm going to share my screen and pull this up. And, you know, it's so interesting to me. I grew up in Baltimore, Maryland. So our front porch, it was often called a stoop. And so the stoop was where the family would get together and we would start having conversations about and keep up with each other and know what was going on in the neighborhood. And then when we would come south and visit, the porch was a place that we congregated as a family. To talk, to share, to connect, and yes, wave at neighbors and get connected at waivers with our neighbors. So I'm really excited about just this whole idea of having conversations and talking specifically today about faith-based community development, because like I said, this is a passion of mine and I'm excited to share more with you today. So we're just going to start moving through. So we'll start with just some virtual meeting etiquette. I know this is something that's new to me, but we're just asking, and thank you. We have a lot of folks on and who are still coming on, so I'm grateful for that. We do want to start on time and end on time. We certainly ask that you be respectful to presenters and attendees. We're going to take some breaks during the conversation. I will be doing a lot of the talking, but I also we'll take breaks so we can engage with you a little bit more directly. So if you would, please use your chat box to put your questions in. And then if you're speaking, if you would just mute your microphone when other people are speaking so we don't get the feedback, that would be great. All right, so a little bit about me. I just told you that I've got this training and nonprofit experience as an educator, community advocate, nonprofit founder, and minister. So I come from a line of folks who serve community. Most of my family are teachers, social workers, nurses. They're all in helping professions for the most part. And so I found myself kind of following along that way. I started out doing this work as a child with my mom, who was very active at church as a volunteer, and I was right there with her, not realizing that it was actually preparing me for my life's work. I hold a Master of Theology and Missions from Union Presbyterian Seminary, graduated from Samuel DeWitt Proctor School of Theology with the Master of Divinity, and I'm also a graduate of North Carolina Central School of Law, so go Eagles. I know we're in Winston. I am a licensed minister of the gospel. My focus in ministry has been community development throughout. I'm a certified John Maxwell coach, teacher, trainer, and speaker, and I was recognized by 1808 magazine a couple years ago as a woman of influence in their annual women's issue. So been living here in the Triad for about 7 years. And we have, during this time, created a for-profit business that's called STC Consulting, LLC. STC stands for Straight to the Core, which is kind of the focus of our work, but my mother's family name is Core, so it's an homage to the family. We are a group of business consultants with expertise in nonprofit startup and operations, mostly board training, technology support, and financial management. So the folks that you see there are my team. In the middle is Julius Rainey, he's our tech support. And the young lady on the bottom is our accountant and director of our financial profitability. And so these are the folks that I work with in serving the community in the development and operation of nonprofit organizations. We do serve mostly community-based nonprofits, churches and faith-based organizations, and we also have some corporate partners that we're doing some work with who have an interest in partnering or getting involved with nonprofits in the community, but need some support and assistance for how to make that happen. And so we provide those services as well. So Cedric mentioned the radio show, which is actually, interestingly, about nonprofits. So I've been on the air for almost 4 years talking about philanthropy and nonprofits as forms of community engagement and empowerment. This is a digital radio station. The show is heard on Fridays at 10 a.m. On WDRB Media and iHeartRadio. And then I have some other programs, older programs that are on SoundCloud, if you all would have an interest in listening to some of those. And those shows feature usually nonprofit leaders, people who started nonprofit organizations, and my team and I also we're also on the show, and then we also feature interviews from folks that are doing the work in the community. So today, this is what we're going to talk about. So I hope everybody's got their tea or their glass of water, and you're going to sit back and we're going to have a chat here on the front porch. So we're going to talk today about the religious basis for charitable giving and how all of that connects up. Christian community development philosophy. I am a trained Christian community development practitioner. How to start a community development corporation. The CDC, which is the acronym for Nonprofit Organization Formation Process, and sources of funding. So let's get started. So when we look at America's historic roots, we see that in the Judeo-Christian faith that love and giving are mandated really by the Bible and the sacred writings. We look and see in history where Jews, Catholics, African-American Protestants first established what were segregated ministry outreaches and charitable works that served primarily their own communities. So you see where you have the establishment of hospitals, other charitable organizations to address needs in their own community, things like burying the dead, ministering to the sick, supporting welfare services. And in the antebellum period, we see social reform where the Catholics are doing traditional and broad sense directing church members to aid the poor, the hungry, and the homeless. So in the faith community, giving back, taking care of community is very consistent and a part of what faith communities do. And interestingly, it's been done in a lot of different ways. So when we look at the African American church specifically, we understand that a lot of the charitable giving that we've seen historically has generally been crisis driven. So when you look at the social stresses from slavery to northern migration, to poverty, to civil rights participation, giving occurred primarily through the African American church to assist victims or address the needs of the time. And it's interesting for me right now because as we experience this move towards equity, towards inclusion, towards Black Lives Matter, I find ourselves, the way that I see it is that we're very much kind of, I won't say we're repeating the civil rights movement, but I think that we are in a time now where we can move forward and support the movement. And the civil rights movement was a movement that was born out of the African American church as well. So many of the social changes that have come in America, particularly as it relates to African Americans, has come from a movement in local grassroots communities that were centered around local churches. So at the African American church has provided socially and economically our communities through formal giving, informal giving, and through volunteering. And this is really just an inherent part many times of how African American churches operate. Healthcare, education, social services, political empowerment were major areas of philanthropic need all the way back to colonial times. So we see that by 1793, independent African American churches in the North had begun to assume charitable missions of the Free African Society. And through that, they were agitating for social, political, and economic rights. And then you also see during Reconstruction, the growth of religious charitable institutions where we now have orphanages and schools. Many of the HBCUs, particularly in the South, were started by religious organizations. So benevolent societies, poor relief organizations, you see all of that happening coming out of the Black church. So when we talk about what is the actual connection between church and philanthropy and church and state, I think that we've had there's been some confusion about it and what it actually does and what does the Constitution say. And while we're not going to dig into deeply in this, I just wanted to lift up some things that I think will help clarify some of the questions sometimes I found that churches have in expanding how they are doing their outreach or their ministry within local communities. So the United States Constitution established the separation of church and state, which requires that religious organizations rely completely upon donations for its support and for the support of any of its charitable acts. So the US government doesn't want to be in the business of supporting churches, and which is kind of like a tacit approval of churches. So when the Constitution separated church and state, religious congregations became a new sector of society, and they became their own philanthropic sector. So the congregants and members of all of our churches are all potential donors to our church, and which is how the philanthropy connects in. And so this new sector, though, is separate from government, and it's also separate from for-profit business sectors. So according to the IRS, churches, which includes integrated auxiliaries and conventions or associations of churches that meet the requirements of Section 501c3 of the Internal Revenue Code, are automatically considered tax exempt and are not required to apply for and obtain recognition of exempt status from the IRS. So many times when I'm talking with clients, they have churches, they have a question about whether they should or shouldn't apply for the 501c3, but the IRS really has already given that same status is automatically given to a church if it meets the 501c3 requirements, so that they do not have to file paperwork. And then the donors then are allowed to claim a charitable deduction for donations to a church that meets the 501c3 requirements, even though the church has not sought or received IRS recognition that it's tax exempt. So again, what the IRS tax code has done is created this as an incentive for donors to give to nonprofit organizations and to churches. By giving them an opportunity to deduct a percentage of their donation. I just read this week that the CARES Act actually implemented a change in charitable contributions so that individuals can now give 100% of their adjusted gross income. It used to be 50%. And corporations are now able to donate 25%. So we're seeing some changes that are interesting, but it's as a result of COVID-19. So Christian community development is a philosophy that I was introduced to, as I mentioned earlier. It's probably been about 23 years ago as a seminarian. But it's a philosophy that is based in biblical and practical principles. And it was developed by the Reverend Dr. John M. Perkins, who himself was a participant in the civil rights movement in Mississippi. So this philosophy has now supported over 40 years of Christian-based community transformation ministry, not only in the United States, but around the world. And it is a model that I use in working with my clients, and we'll dig into that a little bit more. So the most creative long-term solutions to the problems of the poor are coming from grassroots and church-based efforts. So oftentimes what we've seen the model in missions, or the model even as Rod was talking about how we do community service and how we do nonprofit work, is sometimes coming from the outside. It's not the people who live in the community who are actually part of the decision making about what is happening. So the Christian community development philosophy requires that the community has to be involved. So the core of this work is empowering people who live in under-resourced communities to participate in identifying their own challenges and solutions for themselves. And in the number of years that I've been doing this work, I've never gone into a community where the people didn't know what was going on and what their problems were. And many times they had very innovative solutions for what needed to happen. What they lacked was resources and connection to other people who could help them have the resources that would empower them to put some things in place. So a CDC-DA uses this statement, which I love, that today's problems, and I'm sure we could agree with this, we're very much in a season where we're trying to figure out what to do. And so CCDA says that there's a need now for strong commitment and risky actions on the part of ordinary Christians with heroic faith. And what I love about this model is that you begin to see the empowerment, the growth, and the development of individuals, of families, and the community. So when our nonprofits are strengthening individuals, individuals then can help, you can then help strengthen the family. And when families are strengthened, then you can have strong communities. And when you have strong communities, you have strong cities. So it really begins in the grassroots, where we really get access to people kind of one by one or in small groups to be able to create workable models that really can be reproduced in other communities. So the question I would ask for us today, and all of us would be, how can or will you respond to the troubles of the poor and under-resourced communities in our local communities? There's no one right answer. It's going to take all of us working together, being innovative about how we address community challenges, because what COVID-19 has done for us, well, I'll say, first of all, what it has not done is created these problems in communities. They were already there. What COVID-19 has done, it has exacerbated it. And so that now it's very much on front page. So for those of us who are practitioners in this space, we already know what's going on the ground. We already know what's going on. Our challenge perhaps has been trying to get other people to recognize and understand what's going on in local communities. But COVID-19, in a very strange way, I think is putting a lot of community concerns, particularly with poor and under-resourced communities, on the front burner. So there are 8 components, key components of this Christian community development philosophy, and I'm going to talk a little bit about each of them. The first one is relocation. So as a practitioner of Christian community development, I made a decision to follow the call. And the instruction with relocation is that you relocate yourself into the community and live among the people you serve. And I can tell you that when you are there, and now they're not clients or folks that we serve, they're now true neighbors. They literally are the people that live upstairs, downstairs, and next door. And so by relocating also, it shows a willingness on the part of individuals that want to help the community change to come and be a part of the change, as opposed to coming from the outside in, do a little bit, and then kind of go back out again. Reconciliation. So there is a component of reconciliation that does talk about racial reconciliation within the community, because within this model, we understand that it's going to take everybody to deal with the problems that exist in a city. And so my work in this area has been a part of helping start a nonprofit in an under-resourced area that had majority African-American neighbors, but we also were very intentional about connecting them to other churches, other faith communities outside of our neighborhood, where our sisters and brothers of the faith did not look like us. And so by being able to, and we were very intentional about how we created those relationships, but it really does take a willingness on everybody's part to be a part of the process. Redistribution speaks to actually redistributing power. So there has to be a willingness to redistribute power by releasing resources that folks have that they aren't really using, or they may be allocating somewhere else because they're not aware that there's a need. So in the example I gave you, we were able to create relationships with churches who began to put our program into their yearly budget. And so if they had a missions budget at the church, then they would allocate money into our faith-based nonprofit organization. It's very critical in this philosophy too, that this work be church-based. So we understand as followers of our faith that we have the answers, we have the resources, we have the people. Oftentimes, in all honesty, we may be disconnected from the community our church is sitting in. We may have some understanding of what we think is going on in the community and what we think people need in the community. And unfortunately, the typical missions model sometimes is to make some assumptions without really asking the people in the community, what do they need? And it seems like a novel idea. It's so basic, but oftentimes in our passion and excitement about serving the community, we often do not give the people in the community access to what it is that we'd like to do and get some direction from them about how we need to focus our energies as a church or as a faith-based nonprofit organization. So empowerment, leadership development, listening to the community, and a holistic approach are the other components that have kind of grown on. So in the early days, it was just relocation, reconciliation, and redistribution. But over time, we've come to understand that these other components are all important, as well as these original three, and that this focus be church-based. So there's room now and a philosophy here about how churches can become more involved. So my experience is with the development of the Community Development Corporation. It is a 501c3 nonprofit organization. They're created to support and revitalize communities, especially those that are impoverished or struggling. Many CDCs, as we've seen them built around the country, have dealt with development of affordable housing. So you have churches like West Angeles Church of God in Christ out in Los Angeles that has created a full community. They started doing financial management and teaching those kind of skills to their members and people in the community. And as they started there, the community then began to ask for help with home buying. And so that was how they got into affordable housing. They were able to get some federal grants and actually construct new housing and then rehab some old housing that was adjacent to the church. You see a lot of these also as you have some nonprofit organizations, CDCs, that have built shopping centers where the church may relocate itself into the shopping center or build a strip mall, put itself in there, but then also bring economic development to the community by allowing business owners to rent these spaces. And so, which the nonprofit corporation owns and manages. So it can be a wide array of community services. It has to meet the local needs. So it can be education focused, it can be job training focused, it can be healthcare focused. As I mentioned, commercial development, other social programs right now, as I'm working with clients. where I'm seeing the push and the focus, where funding is and where the need is really in the very basics of food, shelter, and housing. So we have, again, like populations, like the homeless population, who had no place to shelter in place. So we have some concerns now. And so this is where some of these CDCs perhaps can step in to address some of these issues. So the CDC is a valuable tool for widespread community outreach beyond the walls of a local church. And the church does not have to be large to be able to do this work. Church and CDC partnerships create avenues for economic empowerment and citywide engagement. And the mechanics of how this works is that the church sets as a separate entity, and this community development corporation does as well. And the church and this nonprofit can then partner together on projects on how they're serving the community. And then they also can partner with other 501c3 organizations, other churches, other nonprofits to actually do the work. Okay, so that was a whole lot right there. And I want to take a break right now. And this is where we're going to do some Q&A. I know I shared a lot of information, and I'm going to go into the chat. And yes, Sheena, hi there. Yeah, we do. And it is going to take working together. Okay, who's that talking about a marble stoop? Yes, that's Baltimore all day and all night. All right. So let's talk about, okay, we have any questions? Oh, thank you so much, Joy, I appreciate that. So let's talk a little bit about what you've heard so far, if you have any questions or what your thoughts are. Oh, okay, great. All right, thank you, Mitchell. Okay. Yes, so LaShonda, yes. So your existing nonprofit could potentially partner with a local church. And what we usually are trying to do there with the partnerships is to fill in the spaces for the resources that are needed, so that the weight is not on one agency to provide everything. Because that's kind of how we've financially been able to do that. If you've got a large nonprofit, you can generate the kind of income and revenue that's needed to do the work. But for smaller nonprofits, the strategy really is to find other nonprofits that are doing similar work in your community and partner together, so that you pool your resources to be able to do the work. Let's see, best way to obtain information from the community on what they need. So I've seen people do that a lot of different ways. One thing, just listening to Rod, knowing that they have already done some research, is to check with them about some of the research that they've gathered already. Because again, you save your time, save your energy by going to agencies who already have the data. They've already pulled the data. Now, beyond that, that's a good place to start, because if you're thinking about starting a nonprofit organization, then it's going to need to be needs-based and fundable. So with the needs-based, then you also want to perhaps even talk to the community. So you can talk to social service agencies that serve that community and talk to them about community needs and the services that are being provided. You can actually look at and talk to other nonprofits, or look at their websites to see what are they already doing. The strategy would be that you don't want to reinvent the wheel, but you do want to bring something to it that's going to be innovative and helpful. And if you can help 2 or 3 other nonprofits do the work, then that's a great way to do it and to create these partnerships. The other piece of that is that as you create partnerships, it puts you in a better position for private funding. So we're going to talk about funding a little bit later, because a lot of funders want to know, are you working with other people who are doing similar work, or are you just working by yourself? And so I think what COVID is doing right now is that it is really pushing us to a place for us to connect with each other and to work together. Let's see. CDC is Community Development Corporation. Thank you, Kenneth. All right, thank you. All right, and smaller nonprofits. So the size of your nonprofit doesn't matter. I have clients, most of our clients are 3 to 5 board member nonprofit organizations. And we were just able to assist one of our clients to get a CARES grant, and their nonprofit is small and about a year old. So it's all about focusing on where the needs are and where the funding is. I haven't heard of any CDCs. This is great. Okay, so Joy, I'll talk to you privately. And then, yeah, so a lot of times you will see a nonprofit, but it doesn't always have the word Community Development Corporation in it. Some of them do, but I would encourage you to just Google Community Development Corporations and see how many nonprofits come up. So typically, this is a model that we've been using in the faith-based community for, like I said, about 40 years now, of doing ministry in our community using a nonprofit form, business form. Thank you so much, Dia Barnwell. Okay, great, thank you. All right, great. And that's great. And I'll have some contact information at the end for those of you all that may want to reach out. Yes. So Goler CDC is in Winston. I had not heard of them, but I just saw them the other day. Yes, they are CDC. When I went to their website, I think that's how they identify themselves, as a community development corporation. So now you'll know that when you're looking at other nonprofits and you see CDC, you'll have an understanding of what that is. Simon G. Atkins, CDC, is also in Winston, yes. And then I'm a member of St. Peter's Church and World Outreach Center, and we have a CDC as well. So ours has focused on education. We also currently have a food pantry. We've had to extend it. So we've been doing clothes and food distribution. We are now doing mainly food distribution because the need is so great in our community. And so you do have some other organizations and churches who have started some. CDC fees can vary. Very good resource. I was on the board of Liberty. Okay. Consultant to go. Okay, great. Well, thank you, Neighborhood Hands, for that information. Okay, so anything anybody else wants to share, or if you want to take a couple of minutes just to maybe get a drink. Okay, so it's Ujima, so great. So if you'll check your chat, we've got some really knowledgeable participants that are identifying some CDCs that are in Winston-Salem, which is great. I'm gonna take a minute to write them down myself. And what I would just suggest you do, okay, all right, Joy, I'm gonna answer your question in just a minute. Okay, and then it was Goler. All right. Okay, so Joy is asking, why would we need a church to sponsor a CDC if a church is also considered a nonprofit? So I'm speaking today to churches that may want to expand their mission outreach. So most churches are already operating with internal programs that may serve their local community or just may serve their congregation. So when a church decides that it wants to do some broader outreach, so, you know, it's one thing to do missions at the church locally in the community. It's a totally different thing to want to build housing. So a lot of it really is going to go back to how big is the vision and what kind of funding are you going to need and funding sources. So at the end of the day, while we do this work because we love the work, it's still always about the money. So what your vision and the money that you're going to need and where you can access the money is going to make a difference about whether the church decides to do a project itself or whether the church decides that it wants to start a nonprofit. So I'm working with a client now who is doing food distribution in Gastonia. They are wanting to build a community center, which will actually be kind of a house recreation type center. But in the meantime, they're in a community that desperately needs help with food scarcity and people getting access to food. So the church itself is already doing a giveaway program of its own. They're able to do, for Thanksgiving and Christmas, they may do 10 food baskets and give them out to either people in the congregation or people that their congregation knows in the community that could use the support. Where they are now is that they want to be able to serve a broader community. So the first thing they did was go to the city to say, hey, this is what we want to do. Will you give us money to do that? The city said, we do not give churches funding. We will give funding to a nonprofit organization, and it can be faith-based, but we will not give money to the church. That goes back to separation of church and state and how that's typically interpreted by government entities, cities, states, federal government. So what they asked me to do was to help them build a separate CDC, and that nonprofit organization will partner with the church. So the church is still going to do their 5 baskets, but what the nonprofit wants to do is be open 3 days a week for 4 hours a day, where they're actually serving food to the community for anybody in the community, and it's not limited to serving the congregation. So that's how that would work. Okay, great. And we have Union CDC at Union Baptist Church. Thank you. Okay. And then Dr. S.D. Patterson is Executive Director of Neighborhood Hands. Okay, very good. All right, any more questions? Okay, so we're gonna close out this chat for a bit and we're gonna move on here. Let me see. Okay, so now we're going to shift gears and we're going to talk about philanthropy itself and what it is. So the first part, I really wanted to just talk about the church, specifically faith-based communities, faith-based ministry, and community development. Now we're going to move into really more of philanthropy, what it looks like in the community, and then how the church fits in. So when you hear the term 501c3 charitable organization, there actually are 2 types. So the first one is called public charity. And so for most of the work that we do as churches, as faith-based organizations, as nonprofits, it's going to go in this category where we're providing hands-on services and programs to the public. So that's one half. Now the other side is private foundations. That's where the money is. So these foundations are financially support public charity services and programs. So they may be your local community foundation. They may be private funds that people have set up to support the public charities. They may be things like the Ford Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation. When you hear about a lot of those foundations, they're private, they're 501c3, but they are private and they exist to be a place to get money and distribute money. So what we're seeing happening right now during this push for more equity, inclusion, diversity, is that we're watching the philanthropy community, the private foundation community is having conversations about what do we do with the money? How do we allocate the money? They're examining barriers that nonprofits may have in getting access to the money, particularly nonprofits led by African Americans and people of color. And they're now beginning to release this money into the nonprofits, the public charities who are actually on the ground doing the work. So here's one thing that I'm clear about, is that government, our local government, federal, municipalities, whatever it may be, cannot do everything. Nonprofits usually fill in the gap. And when you go back to the churches being exempt and these faith-based nonprofits, CDCs, being able to become 501c3s, this is kind of the IRS's tacit understanding that government can't do it all. There needs to be something going on in local communities that's going to take care of community needs. So we usually will see these two bodies usually and sometimes acting together. So most recently where we saw that happen is that the United Ways, I know here in Greensboro, I think you all did the same in Winston and Forsyth County, partnered with the city or partnered with United Way and the community foundations locally, and they created a pool of funding to help nonprofits that were on the ground during COVID, during the work. And so we're starting to see now that there's a little bit more of a partnership and a connection between these two 501c3 charitable organizations. So when we're talking about a nonprofit, it is a corporate entity, and it's formed for the purpose of serving a public benefit other than the accumulation of profits for owners and investors. So these nonprofits, the focus is, and this may be kind of this is a primer for some people, and some folks may understand this already, but I'm addressing this really so that our church members can understand and our churches can understand how this works. So when you create the CDC, you actually are creating a separate business. It is separate from the church, and its focus cannot be on the accumulation of profits for the people who are founded and who operate it. They're tax exempt, we've talked about that, and they typically are charities, foundations, we just talked about that, social welfare, advocacy organizations, they can be professional or trade associations, and here we are, religious organizations as well. So we just talked about the classification of the two. So why would you want to start one of these? And I'm going to go through 4 benefits of why it would be beneficial to start a CDC nonprofit organization. So first of all, you get the 501c3 is going to give that nonprofit, that faith-based nonprofit, tax exemption so that it does not have to pay federal income tax. Also, the nonprofit, that 501c3 approval will oftentimes give the nonprofit an exemption from some state taxes. And then if an organization has the 501c3 tax exempt status, then we already know that an individual or a company's charitable contribution to that entity is going to be tax deductible as well. So this is kind of where you see a similarity. Even though we said that churches don't have to get the 501c3, they're still being given the same benefit as if they were a 501c3 organization. The next one is eligibility for public funding and private grants. And this is typically what kind of tips things in the direction of folks deciding to start a nonprofit, perhaps, is that most funders, public funding and private grant funding, is going to require the 501c3 designation. The reason they do that is because during the process of starting the organization, there's a very high level of transparency because this nonprofit is going to be using other people's money. So public grants are generally awarded to public charities from local, state, and federal governments, but this sometimes is a barrier for churches. Churches are not always eligible for this type of funding, but again, because of disaster relief, we've seen federal FEMA money be made available to churches in this COVID-19 season to help them keep their food pantries running. So that's not the usual, but you know, these times are really calling for, I think, some new methods of how we're going to serve people and how we're going to get funding to people and resources and services to people. Private foundations are generally financially supported by one or a small handful of sources. So it could be an individual, could be a family, could be a corporation. that is running a private foundation. And so you're looking, I'm seeing nonprofits and these foundations now starting to make money more readily available to support what's going on and help with nonprofit operations for those that are still on the ground. The other thing that just kind of came across my mind too is that CARES grant money has been made available from the federal government. It's reached states, and then some of the counties like Guilford County is using part of the CARES Act money to actually give grant money to nonprofit organizations that are providing support with food distribution, medical transportation, medical supplies, and public health. So they have tapped into where the needs are, but then too, the private grantor reserves the right to determine who they want to give money to. So just by getting the 501c3, that in and of itself for the nonprofit organization will generally help them at least get through the first hurdle of being able to apply for grants. And then again, like I said, so for many government agencies and foundations, that they just want that 501c3 designation in place. So moving what you've been doing, perhaps what I would call volunteer, to a CDC, to, again, this is about expanding, reaching more people, is that setting it up as a nonprofit now provides a formal structure for the business. So as we give as our churches, we're really volunteering. This is the next step where those efforts now become a business, so that the nonprofit, it's called a nonprofit corporation actually in North Carolina. It has to have state approval to operate. It is a legal entity on its own. It's going to be separate from the people that found it. So if the church decides to pull together a group in the community and say, hey, we want to get this nonprofit organization started, it doesn't belong to any of the founders. They're stewards, and they may become board members so that they may have administrative responsibility, financial responsibility. But unlike a for-profit business, you can't own the nonprofit. But the obligation is to steward it appropriately. So the nonprofit's mission and the structure has to be above the personal interests of the individuals associated with it. So that there has to be this clear line of demarcation between what the church does and what the faith-based nonprofit organization that they may want to start is doing. They can work together, they can partner, but the finances have to be separate, the meetings have to be separate, everything has to be kept separate, because it is its own separate legal entity that can operate really with the church or without the church and with other nonprofits or other churches in the community as well. The documents are filed with state and local entities are public records. So this is again for transparency so that people can go in and see, okay, yeah, this is a legitimate nonprofit organization. And gaining state and IRS approval for the nonprofit informs potential donors that your organization is legitimate, because this is where we really have to have the end in mind at the beginning, which is we know why we want to do the work. And as we build this business, we have to understand what services and programs do we want to offer, what's the need, and then where are we going to get funding. So funding is always a concern. It's not a worry, but in operating this type of business, just like a for-profit business, you have to be concerned about where the funding is coming from to ensure that you can keep your programs operating. And so your programs and services do not have to be overly extensive. You can have something that really is very simply put together that can have a great impact on the community. The fourth benefit of this CDC nonprofit is that there is some limited liability that comes with it that's afforded by the state. So because this nonprofit is called a corporation, a nonprofit corporation, there are some limitation, and this is not legal advice, this is just some educational information, so that the creditors and courts are limited to the assets of the nonprofit. That means they can't come after the founders, they can't come after the church, they would have to come after the nonprofit organization. So there's a shield of protection that's there for the nonprofit that may not be in place for the church. Founders, directors, members, employees are generally not going to be personally liable for the nonprofit's debts. However, there's an exception, of course, to every rule, and a person cannot use the corporation to shield illegal or responsible acts on his or her part. So again, it's this whole idea of transparency. You're handling the public's money. So there needs to be clarity about where's the money coming from, how is the money being handled. And so there's a higher degree of financial reporting and record keeping that comes along with this. And then directors have a fiduciary responsibility and may be held liable for not acting in the nonprofit's best interest. So there is some obligation, of course, that comes along with this. And you actually can buy insurance for some of these things. Okay, so we're going to take another little break here. Oops, let me go back. And wanted to see if there are some other questions here that I can answer for you as it relates to what we've talked about at this point. Nothing, we're good? Okay, excellent. All right, so we'll go forward, and we're really making very good time here. So the nonprofit formation process, I really kind of scaled this down a little bit, but I'll dig into it. We're just about done with our first hour. So I do want to leave some time a little bit later. We're going to talk probably a little bit more about this and about funding sources, because that's an important conversation that we need to have. For anybody that's thinking about starting a nonprofit, or even who has one, you know, funding is an ongoing issue. But at the very beginning, I really have kind of whittled this down into 3 basic steps for creating a nonprofit organization in North Carolina. So initially, there you have to file the paperwork and get the state recognition. This is for the nonprofit, not for the churches, unless there's a church that wants to get a 501c3, but it's not necessary. In between number 1 and number 2, securing the 501c3 tax exempt status, a lot is happening in between those 2 things. So there's a need to secure an employee identification number, to create bylaws, to identify board members. So there's conversation and planning going on. And this is the time where you may want to pull in the people from the community. So I've seen, when I worked with the CDC that I had been sharing about earlier, we had a site. So it's a little bit different now because virtual, you know, being virtual, it's kind of changes some things. But we actually had a site. And so we did a community dinner. And we invited the community to come out and to have an evening with us where we served dinner. This happened to be a reentry program. So our participants in the program, we had many of them that were great cooks, and some of them were chefs. And so we actually engaged our participants in preparing the event, setting up for the event. And, you know, they were inviting their own family members. We also were inviting the other members of the community, our neighbors, to come and spend that time with us. And we did it the first time, not being sure how people would respond. But we were pleasantly surprised, and a lot of people came that evening. The most important thing that happened for us that night is that we found out who the natural leaders were in the community. Because one of the challenge that we had is that although I lived in the community, the founder did not live in the community. So there was some community distrust about a stranger coming in to do something, and people just weren't really clear about what that was. So we basically decided that we would show ourselves friendly, and we went out in the community, we walked around in the community, we literally talked to people in the community and made personal invitations and some flyers to get people to come out. That actually morphed into what would become a monthly family night, neighborhood family night, where we would cook and have a program. It might be a talent show. It might be something. What we wanted to do was to bring back a sense of hope to a community that had at that time the highest murder rate in the city, the highest drug rate in the city. The worst of whatever you can think of was in this one community. And there were many churches in this community, but nobody was really getting a handle on how to help the community, our neighbors. Some of those folks were members of the churches in that community. And, people were scared to come out of their houses at night. When the sun would start going down, you would just see the street would just become totally quiet. And about 11 o'clock, you would begin to see the drug pushers, the other folks that were in the community, and they literally would just take it over all night long. And so that's how we started. Going into this community, we knew that there was a need there. We did initially partner with the police department. We talked with them. And we began having some early conversations with the city, with the city council member for the district that we were in, to really try to get some information and to get involvement at as many levels as we could. So this is what's going on while the paperwork is being filed, is that it's really clear that relationship building has to be very, very intentional in this process so that you can get buy-in from the people in the community as well as potential funders. So what we found was that because we were willing to try, the police department decided they wanted to work with us. The city said, okay, we want to work with you, because there was a question about what do we do? We were coming with an answer that, in all honesty, we were hoping was going to work. But we were very convinced in our spirit that this was the work that we needed to do. But we had to stay flexible in figuring out how to do it, how to stay mission focused, but still be very aware of what the needs are in the community and what the community said they needed, not what we thought they needed. So as we go through this process, you build, get some information, and then you secure the 501c3 tax exempt status. Depending upon the size of your program, there are a couple different filings that you can make to secure the tax exempt status. And then in North Carolina, there is a requirement for charitable solicitation license registration. So what the state is doing in number 3 here is that they're asking every nonprofit that intends to do any kind of public solicitation to get a license and to register with the state to do that. That is not that's not an idea, that's actually a requirement. So a requirement for any nonprofit that wants to get involved in public fundraising needs to apply and to get that license in place so that they can do that. So once you work through all of these steps and you have all your pieces of paper, then you are then done with the formation process. And I always look at this process, it appears to be, kind of 1, 2, 3, but it actually is the floor. It's the foundation for your programs and services, which will be like the walls and the roof. So the formation piece is very important. And then within this, as we move from this formation into operations, what we then focus on is building internal capacity within the nonprofit organization so that it can operate. So when we talk about an internal capacity, what we're talking about is two things. We want to meet mission and be sustainable over time. So we don't want to build this nonprofit and have it be a one-hit wonder. We really want to build and put the kind of capacity in place that is going to allow it to grow and build. So when we talk about capacity, we're talking about leadership development. We're talking about financial management. We're talking about how to use technology in the operations of your nonprofit organization. We're talking about building up these internal skills within the business that take you actually to the creation of your programs and services, and it all connects together around funding. So this is, and I'm going to go through each one of these and we'll talk a little bit. And I think Cedric is going to jump in as we talk about the qualified opportunity zones. So when we are thinking of from the beginning about the work we want to do in our local community, we have to be thinking about where can we get money from. So one of the strategies for grassroots organizations that works very, very well is partnering. We talked a little bit earlier about that, sharing of resources. You have a lot of local churches who have the resources and the funding, and they have a heart to do community work, but their congregation is like 70 years old. So they're not physically perhaps interested in actually being out and doing grassroots work, but they would happily fund somebody who's doing that. You would have to create those relationships. And the 501c, and so it doesn't have to be churches with churches. Churches can partner with these 501c3s. For-profit businesses also, and I didn't put schools, we'll talk about that. But for-profit businesses, so I work with some corporate clients. They are for-profit businesses who are very much concerned about how they can serve their local communities. They are willing to write checks. They are willing to be volunteers. They are willing to, whatever way that they think that they can financially support your nonprofit, they're willing to do that. And now more than ever, we're really seeing a lot more of the partnership now because of COVID. Local and state governments, there are some initiatives. So when I talked about the CARES grant, that's federal money, but it's being administered through Guilford County government, and the applications themselves are being reviewed by the United Way. So you see this partnership there, so that they can do the work of helping funding nonprofits. Public agencies, there may be some public agencies in the community, Red Cross, Department of Social Services, American Heart Association, other large agencies who have a mission to be in front of local communities that don't have the relationships with people in the communities to come in. Your nonprofit organization or your church can create relationships and bring those groups in. So it's a win-win. Your people get much needed information, and then the agency then is now meeting its mission, and many of them are nonprofits as well. So partnerships can be a really rich way of creating resources. And what I love about this business forum is not only can the funding would be in cash, but the 501c3 designation also allows for donations to be in kind, so that if you need items and another nonprofit has the item already, rather than go buy it, they can just donate it. or people in the community can donate the things that you need so that your nonprofit is not having to spend all of its funding. And churches can do that as well. So when we talk about public fundraising right now, we definitely are needing to talk about virtual events. So I have a client that does a sickle cell walk every year. And due to COVID, they're not able to do it, to be out walking around in the community. But what they have decided to do is to do a virtual walk and to still have people pay to walk in their annual walk. And they're encouraging people to get out and walk around in their local community. So they are, wear a mask, stay 6 feet, do the physical distancing. But they still have generated a way to get funding by people participating in the event, even though it's not being done, in the public. Public fundraising also includes putting donate buttons on your website, putting donate buttons on your Facebook page. I think Instagram, has just added something. They're connected to Facebook. So I think that they're adding buttons now where people can donate. That is considered public fundraising, and it can be very, very lucrative to create opportunities for people to give while they're already looking at your website or whatever your social media presence may be, if it's Facebook or Instagram. Or LinkedIn is not doing the fundraising piece, but Instagram, Facebook, and your own website is going to be a good way to use those buttons. Crowdfunding. So public fundraising too, nonprofits can do GoFundMes. So that type of crowdfunding, you can do crowdfunding. Peer-to-peer fundraising is something that's become more popular, where you may find 5 people and all 5 of you are raising money for the same thing. And each individual accesses his or her own network, and you raise money within your own network, and then all that money is pooled and then donated to the nonprofit. And because we're in this virtual space right now, a lot of this can be done pretty simply. Of course, it's a little more to it than just set it up. There's some other things that have to be in place. But these are some innovative ways that existing churches or nonprofits, faith-based nonprofits, can do some public fundraising. So we talked about grants. That's going to be money made available by private foundations to organizations that meet their criteria. In the selection of a grant or a funder that you might want to apply to, you'll need to ensure that what it is that you want to do matches what they fund. So once you have your 501c3 and you're able to apply, then you've got to make sure that it matches the criteria. And you also, part of that process too, is the private foundation is looking at internal capacity through the application. So the question is, if the nonprofit is asking for $30,000, do they have what they need internally to be able to administer that money and use it to meet their programs, to do their services, and to meet their tax exempt mission. So I'm going to jump down to nonprofit social enterprises and then come back to the qualified opportunity zone and let Cedric talk about that a little bit. So nonprofits actually can create a business that may be run within it. So when I was working in this local community, we were a reentry program, and we spent our mornings training our participants, and we worked on soft skills, communication skills, emotional wellness, those kinds of things to help them with their transition back into the community. But in the afternoon, we actually engaged them in a skill building activity. In this case, they actually were trained how to rehab houses. So we also had a thrift store that was a part of the nonprofit, And our goal was to be able to, of course, raise some funding by people coming in and purchasing some of it. But when we made our initial application, there was a concern about the IRS about whether this thrift store actually was benefiting the nonprofit, or was this really a for-profit entity kind of masquerading behind the nonprofit. What we decided to do is that we wanted to use that thrift store as a training center for our participants to help them develop communication skills, to help them develop customer service skills, to help them develop sales skills, to help them develop how you ring customers up. So we created a curriculum around preparing people to do customer service work, our participants. And now at that point, that business activity was substantially related to advancing our organization's charitable purpose. So if you're going to think about creating something like that, then it's going to have to connect to the organization's charitable purpose and or be insubstantial. So if it's going to have a business component to it, perhaps where it's bringing in some money, then it's going to have to be something real insubstantial in relation to when you look at what the organization is doing in a whole, what that business, how that fits into what the entire organization is doing. So over time, that particular nonprofit has developed about 5 or 6, it might be 7 separate businesses. And each business grew out of our clients having special skill sets, but also still having barriers to being employed because a number of them were felons. So rather than, once we ran into the problem of actually trying to place them in the community to work, what we said is, okay, we're going to have to build our own environments for them. So it expanded to a restaurant, to a catering service, to a moving company, to an estate sale business. So we were able to create these businesses. We took the stress off of our participants about going to find work, and we gave them work. And then we also created an incubator. So for those of them that wanted to be entrepreneurs, we would train them in the incubator. So that's an example of what these nonprofit social enterprises can look like. So Cedric, you want to jump in now and talk to us more about these qualified opportunity zones?
Yes. All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Doe. I'm going to make this really quick. We only have about 8 minutes left. So qualified opportunity zones are economically distressed communities defined by individual census tracts, nominated by America's governors and certified by the U.S. Secretary of the Treasury via delegation of the authority to the Internal Revenue Service. So basically, these are mechanisms that are private in terms of the funding. And so in Winston-Salem, I believe there are qualified opportunity zones. If you go on, you should be able to go on to the website for the city of Winston-Salem and go to the planning department, and you should be able to identify the opportunity zones within the city of Winston-Salem. One of the neat things, and I'll drop a few of these links in the chat and also email them to you, there was a group of churches in Baltimore, and they actually came up with a plan in terms of revitalization, in terms of revitalizing the city of Baltimore. So it's called the East Baltimore Revitalization Project, and it was actually brought together by Reverend Dr. Dante Hickman out of Baltimore. And so I'll share this link with you. It's a great plan. It's about 50 pages long of how these churches partnered with for-profit entities as well as other nonprofits to come up with a plan to maximize the opportunity zone feature in terms of the federal government to revitalize their community and help out their city. It's a great read if you have time. And also there's some more information about opportunity zones and anchor institutions on a webinar by EIG, which is the Economic Innovative Group. And I will share those with you in the chat as well. So if you have any more questions about opportunity zones, I will email you those links as well as drop those in the chat.
Okay, and you know, I love this. I know you can tell I'm very passionate about this. I could talk about this all day, but our time is short. And so now I want to just extend a call to action. I looked in the chat, our time is short. I'm not going to be able to answer some of those questions because some of them are really more personal questions, but I'm going to give you the contact information shortly right after this slide. So just very, very quickly, I want you to we're going to do this virtual takeaway reflection. I'm asking that you think of something meaningful that you're taking away from today's presentation, and then write this question down. What can I do now with what I've learned today? My goal today has been to give you some information so that when you leave here, there's something that you've heard today that you can take with you now to either help you with your current nonprofit operations, if you're thinking about how you want to move forward. I'd like you to record your answer, sum it up in a word or phrase, and then share your answer with Cedric Parker. So his email is there. I'm gonna also, let's see if we can put it in the chat. I'm sorry. And can you put your email in the chat there for me, sir?
Yes.
And then this work is really covered, and like I said, you know, Christian community development really launched out of the civil rights movement. And so I found this quote by Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King that I want to close with. And he said this, that our goal is to create a beloved community. And this will require a qualitative change in our souls, as well as a quantitative change in our lives. And so as we go forward and we do this work, particularly for the faith community, this is work that is, it's righteous work, and it's an extension of the kingdom in the earth, and in our desire to create a beloved community where we all come together in peace and support and share and build community and take care of our neighbors. So for anybody that wants to contact me directly, please feel free to, my email's not on it. So if you go to my website, stcconsultingllc.org, you can just contact me through the contact page and I'll get information. So for those of you, I apologize that I'm not able to get to all of the questions. Like I said, some of them were a little bit more personal and a little bit beyond what I presented today. But I thank you very much for the opportunity, and I hope this has been a blessing for you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Doe. I am going to use my reaction and give you a virtual clap if you kind of join in with that. Thank you so much for your time today and your expertise. Really great information. Again, if you want to get in contact with Dr. Doe, she did put her contact information there. This session was recorded, so I will follow up by sending out the recording to everyone who's interested, as well as if you have any questions as far as the faith-based community engagement work, please, you have my email address. You could send that to me personally so that we can set up some time to have further conversations. So this will be our first of hopefully many more to come, front porch conversations about the work of the faith community and also how this can work in our communities to help our neighborhoods that are underserved, but most importantly, creating that beloved community. So thank you so much again, Dr. Doe. Thank you for joining us today. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to myself or to Dr. Doe. And thank you for joining us on the front porch. Awesome. You guys take care and have a wonderful rest of your day.